Hey, this is Jonathan from SyniteAudio, and today we'll be looking at D-SEM, the synthesizer voice block for Reaktor 6. So just looking at the panel view, you will see that this voice block contains a VCO section, a filter section, and a dual envelope section. So this is sort of very reminiscent of a certain synthesizer. However, some liberties have been taken and others to be more true to the original. So to begin, let's split the view and let's look at the block itself. So this is the D-SEM block, as in the all-in-one. Looking at the inputs here, we have our pitch input at the top. We have the 2 gate inputs for each envelope section. We have an external input section which can be used for modulation as well as to dial in the external amount on the mixer. You've got an LFO reset section. What this does is, unlike the original, this one you can sync the LFO, and when you give it a 0 to 1 or a positive 0 crossing, the LFO will start in a positive fashion, and when you give it a 0 negative to 1, 0 to negative 1, and you give it a 0 negative 0 crossing, it will start in a descending fashion. I can quickly show that if I get a scope, hook it up to the LFO output. So this is the current LFO. We can go and mess with the LFO speed. However, so if we do, let's disconnect that. If we do a positive 0 crossing, as you can see, it'll sync the LFO, so it'll start syncing it going in a positive fashion. If we give it a negative, so if I do times, oops, gate, we multiply that by a -1, or I could just do an invert function. Then it'll start from the high point and descending instead of starting at a positive 0 value and descending. Yeah. It's a little hard to explain, except if you're running it on a filter as a modulation source, you'll definitely hear the difference. So moving down, after these inputs, going from pitch to LFO reset, everything else is a CV input. So to be used on the panel for when you toggle CV mode, and you can dial in your modulation on a per knob basis. Looking at the output of D-SEM, we have our mix output. So this output goes post-filter. So the way that D-SEM works is you have your VCO section, and then each VCO, there's 2 VCOs, goes into the mix section at the bottom of the filter here. So we go for VCO 1, that goes into here. Then we dial in whether we want a pulse or a saw wave, and then after that, that goes through the filter, which then goes through a VCA. So the envelope 1 here controls the VCA, or the amplitude of the output of the filter, and then that is what gets output. If we, for example, disconnect our mono IO outputs to our speakers and we just hit the VCA button, you'll see that it actually outputs audio. This is because it bypasses the VCA portion of the block. If we hook that back up, you'll see that it does function as intended. So moving down from that, we have our low pass, notch, high pass, and band pass taps. So this is an improvement upon the original in the sense that since we're working digitally, we can output from each portion of the filter individually. So this can be used for mixing purposes, running effects, whatever you want to do with it, you can, which is really nice. It gives you that flexibility. We also have VCO, we have the mix output, so VCO1 mix, VCO2 mix, and the external noise mix. So these are essentially, you can, if you run a CV input on that and you run modulation, you can use these as VCAs just as their own, and these output in the mix outputs here. This is pre-filter and VCA, so you're getting the pure mix output. After that, we have our LFO output, which I just demonstrated earlier with the LFO reset. And then we have the VCO outputs directly. So we have the VCO saw at full volume, pulse at full volume, and then the VCO2 saw and pulse at full volume. This is pre-mixing and pre-filter, so they're at full volume. And then we have the two envelope outputs, envelope 1, which remember is our amplitude envelope, but you can use them modulation wise coming out of the block for anything else, and envelope 2. So that is a simple overview of the I/O, inputs and outputs of D-SEM. Now moving on to the panel, starting at the VCO section, we've got our, this is the same thing twice because there's two VCOs. We've got the coarse knob up here, so 48 up and down, 48 semitones and one at a piece. Then we have our key tracking, so we can disable that and do a selective frequency. This is cool with the sync function in the middle, which hard syncs VCO2 to VCO1. So I'll demonstrate that in the future, but if you already know what hard syncing is, this has a hard sync feature. Moving down is our fine-tune control, and which doesn't have CV modulation. This is purely because you can just modulate the coarse value. And then after that we have the modulation knob itself. So this is the amount, and it's also, it goes both ways. So if you turn it clockwise, it will do pulse width modulation. So this is going towards pulse width modulation. And if you turn it counterclockwise, you're doing frequency modulation. I'll demonstrate that further as well. Below the modulation knob, we have our modulation source. So this will toggle between various modulation sources within the block. Here we have an LFO. So right now it's choosing the LFO as the source. Next, you can choose VCO2, which is an improvement upon the original, since you can have cross FM as well. So you can have each VCO modulate the other VCO. So VCO2 on VCO1 and VCO1 on VCO2. Moving on, we have envelope 1. So just like the original, the VCOs, as a modulation source, they can pick one envelope each. So VCO1 has envelope 1, VCO2 has envelope 2, and then after that we have external. So this is based on the external input. No matter what you run in through here, you can also choose that as a source, so you can run another oscillator block or something through external and then have that mixed in with the filter and the rest of the VCOs, as well as having it as a modulation source. And then we run back into LFO. So we've got a good number of modulation sources just within the block. This isn't even taking into account CV as well. And finally below that, on both sides, we have our pulse width control. So this is a global pulse width control for each VCO before doing pulse width modulation. So that is the VCO section covered. Right here in the middle. So this is the LFO, and this would LFO control, and this is what controls the speed of the LFO, ranging from 0 to 100. These values aren't actually 0 to 100. They're actually I forgot exactly what it's like 0. It's like 0.5 or something to like 15 hertz as a range. And moving on to the filter section, we have our frequency control. We have the resonance control. We've got a positive, negative on the modulation here. So we have positive modulation, negative modulation. And we have the classic SEM filter selection mode that's based off a potentiometer, so go from low pass to notch to high pass, so you can get really cool sweeping sounds out of it, as well as a band pass option that you toggle and it'll turn on the band pass. This is worth noting that it's also cool that you have, since this has each individual filter outputs, you can actually mix this however you want. So you can go between low pass and band pass on a crossfade, or notch and band pass, or just low pass, high pass. Whatever you want to do, the option is available. And then going under the modulation amount, we also have the modulation source. So in this case we have LFO, envelope 2, external. That's much simpler than the VCOs. Moving from that, below that we have our VCO mixer, or just our mixer section in general. So we already covered the VCO portions, because you can do saw going counterclockwise and pulse going clockwise, with that being also an attenuator. So when you're in the middle, there is no signal being output, and then you go and pick your wave shapes. For the external, if you go counterclockwise, which I explored a little earlier, this goes to the external input, and then if you go clockwise, you get into noise. So you have a noise source as well, which you can use for filtering, along with the envelopes to create, you know, some percussion type sounds. Moving on to the envelope section, the dual envelope section. So these are attack, decay, sustain envelopes, or rather attack, sustain, decay. The decay is tied to the release, so that's why it's just 3 knobs as well. If I do, actually let's just do a sawtooth. We can turn down the sustain. We get a nice kind of clicky envelope, which can be used. And this becomes our sort of plucky sound. These envelopes work in an exponential fashion. I'm not sure if the original did. I think exponential sounds much better when you're dealing with sound that you're actually going to audibly hear. It's a little more natural tails. So these all are running in an exponential curve. So there's envelope 1 and envelope 2. 1 controls the amp, as can be seen by the title, and then 2 is usually used for the modulation. So it's a modulation for the filter, and it's a modulation source for VCO2 right here, instead of modulation from envelope 1 to VCO1. So now I'll look at some of the patches. There's the initial preset. I've made some of these, so I labeled them with some sort of descriptive name, and then I have after this line division, I put down what's the main modulation that's causing the sound. So for beating, we have LFO, pulse width modulation. This is actually a good time to get our scope back out. So we'll do in, pitch from pitch. And let's put that right here. So here we can see we have envelope 2 running pulse width modulation and LFO running pulse width modulation, but that's kind of pointless because I actually ended up going with a sawtooth wave shape on VCO1. It's BC beating 2, so this is more envelope pulse width modulation. A little bit of white noise for dustiness. And this is the classic Butterworth. Ooh, gets a little loud. Moving on, some of my favorite ones. So we got like Fantasy. This is LFO on frequency modulation. I was trying to remember a sort of like Casio. Was it Casio? I think one of the little Casio calculator synthesizers. There's like this little. One of them has like a fantasy type sound, and it sort of resembles this. I was trying to sort of emulate that sound. It's a pretty cool sound. I really like it. So actually, before I move on, so yeah, I'm going to show you the LFO. Not the LFO, the pulse width modulation and the frequency modulation. So if I do pulse on VCO1, we got the LFO ready. So I can bring up the pulse width modulation. So this goes all the way up to if your pulse width modulation is in the middle. So it's completely as a square wave. You're gonna have it's gonna swing 100% either way. So that's why you have the blank areas that sort of cuts off. This can also be picked from VCO2, as I explained earlier. Which gives a sort of wave shaping / like wave dividing, which it's actually a really cool sound. I like it a lot. Especially when it's synced. And do a higher course. So moving on, we're going to look at the frequency modulation. So you can see already with a little bit, this really swings. Like you can get a lot of crazy frequency modulation out of this. And you can also do the classic envelope on that as well. So if I bring that down a bit. You get into like sort of drumish territories. And we run that on the envelope as well. So this is, I'm gonna have to do, let's duplicate it, 59.3. Yeah, you can get some pretty cool sounds out of that. So this has been the D-SEM voice block. Now, when you get D-SEM, or looking into the D-SEM components, this actually comes separated as well into its own modules. So if I move everything back quite a little bit, we've got our D-SEM VCO portion. So this contains everything that the DCM VCO contains as well, including the mixer section. So this can choose your oscillator wave shapes. And everything is set up the same, so there's still an external input, envelope 1 and envelope 2 input, and of course the LFO reset, but the envelope 1 and 2 are still included there if you want to use like a bento box LFO, or like the Monarch envelope, or whatever it is you want to do, or not the bento box LFO, the bento box envelope, the ADSR. So you can do that, you can hook that up as well, and it's got all the various outputs, just like the D-SEM block, voice block itself, the completed block. So you have your mix outputs, your LFO, and then your wave shapes, and your completed out, which takes the two mixes and adds them together. Since there's no filter on the D-SEM VCO, there is the D-SEM filter. So this block, which has the VCA function already enabled, which means that it bypasses an envelope having to take care of the VCA, but this is a 6 input. It's interesting because, yeah, this is a 6 input filter with VCA functionality, so it really takes the D-SEM filter section and takes it standalone. So if you want to run, say, 6 inputs into a mixer, this chooses whether it's input 1 or 2. So you can use the CV modulation to flip that based on like sequencer values. If you do logic gates, you can flip that as well between the 2 inputs, and then that will go through the filter and then run through the VCA. There's also you can run an envelope through that. So let me actually delete the original D-SEM, because I will actually show you how to recreate it with just the standalone blocks. Yes, so this also has the mixer output, so mix the N1-2 mix, 3-4, 5-6. This is pre-filter, and we have the filter taps, low pass, notch, high pass, band pass, as well as the main output. The main output is the one that will have the envelope 1 controlling the VCA portion of that. That is very much worth noting. Next we have the dual envelope, and the name is as the name suggests. This is a very simple dual envelope pulled from the D-SEM voice block. So it takes 2 gates, 1 gate to control each envelope, and then it just outputs the 2 envelopes. All of these have CV modulation for all of the onboard front panel knobs. The dual envelope is especially cool. I use it quite a bit because it's 2 envelopes in one. So I can gate these separately however I want. I can run 2 sequencers and just use 1 dual envelope to do the job. So rebuilding the D-SEM voice block works as such. So we're taking our pitch input. Let's work from the left to the right. So we're taking our pitch input, and now we connected that to our VCO. So our VCO has wave shape output, so we're going to bypass the onboard mixer and use the mixer section of the filter. So we're going to need the VCO 1 saw is going to be on our input 1. VCO pulse is going to be our input 2, and then same thing for VCO 2. So saw is on 3, pulse is on 4. And the only thing that you get as a disadvantage if you're using these separately is that instead of having the external noise, there is no noise function. So we're just going to quickly grab a noise oscillator, amplitude of 1, and we're going to hook that up to 6, because if we remember, our external was to counterclockwise input and our noise source was on our clockwise input. So that's hooked up. Next we have the dual envelope generator. So we got the gate, so we need the gate to trigger both envelopes. You can see the lights flash, and if you disable one of these, light will only flash on the appropriate envelope that's being triggered. And now we just hook up all of the inputs where they say to be. So envelope 1, let's throw that into the VCO envelope 1 input, envelope 2 into envelope 2. We've got the LFO output of the VCO going into the LFO output input of the filter, taking the envelope 1, which is the VCA amplitude envelope, running that into envelope 1, 2 into 2, and let's see, that's external. noise, external input for the modulation. Reset, these are directs. Yeah, okay, so everything is hooked up. So this is what the D-SEM voice block, I guess synth block, looks like, broken into threes and then reconstructed with all the inputs reading to the outputs. But if we take our filter up, let's re-enable the VCA, take our filter outputs and run that through like so. Now we can select our wave shapes, saw and pulse. Do our envelope 2. And that is the D-SEM rebuilt. There are, perks of doing having the nice broken up pieces. You can do these separately, so you can have a cool filter envelope section set up already, and then you can just use the D-SEM VCO for the two LFO, or for the LFO and the two wave shapes. And then you can do a bunch of other really cool stuff as well. I didn't go into the syncing, so let's actually do that right now. Let's open that up. Get rid of that. And I'm going to go look at the VCO2, just the pulse, and we're going to hit sync. Just your classic hard sync sounds, which is really cool. Same also applies to the sawtooth as well. So if we flip that to the sawtooth. And you can do cool stuff with the filter, the frequency modulation portion of that. So if I run the envelope into that, turn that down. Right now I have it set up so that the VCO1 controls the filter frequency modulation of VCO2, and VCO2 does the frequency modulation of VCO1. So cross feedback, or yeah, in a sense, and hard synced as well. Disabling that sync. Yeah, you can get some really cool, crazy sounds. You can really break everything, just running crazy stuff through it. And so yeah, that has been the D-SEM synth block for Reaktor 6. I hope you've enjoyed. If you like this video, like and subscribe. I'll definitely be making more because I have a ton of other stuff to cover as well. Yeah, you can get the link for D-SEM in the description, and thank you for watching.